Welcome back to Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime. I'm Nancy Miller, and I guess I'm welcoming myself back because I just enjoyed a lovely 2-week break. And it seems in the past couple of weeks, we have some new listeners to the Dead Sleep podcast. If you are new to the show, welcome. Dead Sleep is a slow-moving true crime podcast made for those who want a mindful mystery. No gore, no 911 calls, and as always, independent and ad-free. Think of Dead Sleep like the 0.5 true crime podcast in a hectic 1.5 world. If you'd like to support the podcast and enjoy a monthly bonus episode among other subscription offerings, you can do so through Patreon, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Your support is how Dead Sleep exists. So thank you to all of the generous subscribers who keep this podcast going and keep my life afloat week after week. And now here we are on the 89th episode. And the nice thing about vacation is, of course, relaxation, along with the opportunity to take a step back, gain some perspective, look at something familiar, and see it all through fresh eyes. And that's the underpinning of tonight's episode. A notorious murder case that looks completely different, even oppositional, depending on one's point of view. Perpetrator, victim, guilty, innocent. A single murder scene, so many different ways. The difference between guilty or innocent, a matter of one's POV. Only which version of this murder mystery is the truth? Now, this is the Dead Sleep version of events custom made to be suspenseful yet soothing, and by no means definitive, and like many true crime stories, there are always conflicting accounts, little logic gopher holes that I've done my best to fill in accurately. But I always encourage you to check out the sources in the show notes for more on this story. It's a murder mystery that takes place in the happiest place on Earth. No, not Disneyland. It's the happiest country on Earth. The small Nordic nation of Finland. Yes, Finland has indeed been ranked the happiest country on Earth by the UN's Happiest Nation Index, 8 years in counting. But how could that be? A small country the size of Montana, near the Arctic Circle, where at least half of the year its 5 million residents are deprived of full sunlight, living in near darkness and Arctic twilight for months at a time. How can people who live there claim to be the happiest people in the world? Well, there are some things that you might expect. The kind of stuff that many European nations have, from social support like healthcare to GDP per capita. That is the health of the economy, to lifespan, to sense of personal freedom, to the perception of corruption and confidence in one's government systems. And while Finland, it ticks all the boxes. Then, of course, there's Finland's natural beauty. In Finland, there is some of the freshest air and water available on this entire planet. Imagine that, waking up tomorrow morning, filling your lungs with fresh, clean, pristine, fresh air that comes from the acres and acres of unspoiled natural forest. Finland is one of the most beautifully natural places in the world, and the Finnish people who live there, they make it a point to go out and enjoy it year-round, every day. And then there are the Finnish people, known for being humble, modest. Their only source of pride is in how they embrace a quality, a word, a philosophy called sisu. Now, there's no direct translation for sisu in English, but in Finnish, sisu essentially means grit, gumption, tenacity, courage in the face of adversity. In sisu, that philosophy has been tested many times over the many centuries, since all the way back in the 1300s, when Finland existed under Swedish rule. That tenacity continued all the way up to World War II, when Finland was invaded by the Russian army and put up a fierce resistance to maintain its sovereign border. And perhaps most enviable is Finland's crime rate. Finland is one of the safest countries in the world. And what few homicides there are, they're typically solved. There's not even much detective work. And that's because the majority of homicides in Finland, they follow a pattern. They are fueled by alcohol, usually an incident between two people, often two men who know each other. A spontaneous rage that ends in a tragic death. And often, these deaths, these homicides, they're not even considered murder. Legally, they're considered manslaughter. And whoever did it, they often turn themselves in and accept the consequences. And even in prison, it seems the Finns are happier than the rest of us. With a prison system that puts a premium on rehabilitation over incarceration. With Finland having some of the most lenient prison sentences in all of the world. So it looks like Finland has it all figured out. How lucky these Finns must feel when they put their head on the pillow every night, knowing they live in the safest, happiest place in the whole wide world. And they can fall into a deep sleep, knowing if they're a good person, if they're a law-abiding citizen, if they're a good Finn with sisu, they can rest easy. There's nothing to worry about. As long as everyone followed the rules and everything went the way it should. A woman named Anna-Lee Auer was one of those people. A model Finnish citizen, smart, successful, fulfilled. Anna-Lee was well-educated, graduating with a master's degree in economics in the mid-1990s, soon after she met her husband, Jukka. That's Jukka. And like most Finnish names, they can be tricky for an American like me to pronounce. And to get it right, I need another 3 weeks of practice. So for the sake of simplicity and to make for a better listening experience, I'm approaching some of the names with a softer English interpretation. Trust me, it is less distracting this way. Right, so Anna-Lee and Jukka, they get married. And by 1997, they have their first child, a little girl. And over the next 8 years, they made a family in an even, measured, and efficient Finnish pace. One child, roughly every 2 years, for a total of 4 children. By 2006, Anna-Lee, now 41 years old, and her 51-year-old husband Jukka had built a life together, strong and stable, much like the town they lived in. Uvila is one of the oldest towns in Finland, with a rich history spanning hundreds of years, all the way back to the medieval era, and rich in ironworks, where for centuries industrial factories forged copper and steel for all of Finland since the 1700s. Uvila is a 2-hour drive northwest from Helsinki. And for many, it's a quaint retreat from the Finnish capital's sleek and modern architecture, more rugged and relaxed pace. And it was that rustic life that Anna-Lee mined herself for material for a blog she created for other busy moms like her. Everything from fun activities with the kids to where to find hand-me-down toys and clothes to honest conversations about juggling life, even in Finland, as a mother, wife, and professional. This was before YouTube, so this kind of offering was unique and in demand. For Annalie, she embodied the calm, cozy, and quiet domestic life mirrored on her blog. That is until the wee hours of December 1st, 2006, when that placid, peaceful existence was shattered with the sound of broken glass. And in a split second, the happiest place in the world would become, for Annalie and her family, hell on earth. It was late, well after 2 o'clock in the morning. Perhaps her husband had had an accident. He'd come home late that night from a grueling business trip. Maybe somehow he'd gotten up and fallen and broken glass. But instantly it was clear. What Annalie soon witnessed, it was an all-out attack. In the once silent night, she now heard yelps and cries, the sound of her husband struggling, and in the darkness, 2 silhouettes. A man, an intruder, in a hoodie, and was that a face mask? Brutally attacking her husband with something. It was all happening right here in her bedroom. Annalie raced forward to intervene, and to her horror, the intruder then turned his attention to her, lunging at her, a knife in his hand. The blade pierced her in the chest area. As she staggered away, a dark red circle forming on her nightshirt, a damp and damning proof that she'd been stabbed. This intruder turned his attention back to her husband, Jukka, who now attempted to thwart the attacker's sharp blows with 2 pieces of wood he grabbed from the couple's nearby fireplace. It was in this moment Annalie would need to think quickly and carefully. If she rushed back in to try and save her husband again, this attacker would lunge at her again and kill her, or at the very least, gravely wound her. And then, who knew? After killing them both, he could go after the couple's 4 children. All of her 4 children were young. The eldest, that's the daughter Amanda, was 9 years old, and the youngest around 2 years old. The kids, as far as she knew, were still in their bedrooms, doors closed, asleep. But how long until they'd emerge, bleary-eyed and curious, then terrified? Annalie exited the bedroom and raced to find a phone, the family's landline, and she dialed 112. That's the emergency number, their version of 911 in Finland and for the greater part of Europe. An emergency dispatcher picked up the call, and Annalie, apparently channeling her inner Sisu, focused on the task at hand. As calmly as she could, she relayed what was happening. Despite the all-out chaos, the broken glass, the struggle, her children somewhere in the house, the situation was brutally simple. There was a man in her house, and he was killing her husband. They needed someone to come to the house right away. Please hurry. With Annalie wounded and her husband at the mercy of a mysterious intruder, it was hard to imagine things getting any worse, but they did. From one of the bedrooms emerged Annalie's oldest child, Amanda. And Annalie faced an impossible scenario, captured mostly through the scratchy line of that single frantic phone call. A stranger somewhere out there in a distant call center advising Annalie to stay on the line. But there was a stranger closer to home, in her home, just a room away, brutally trying to end the life of the man she loved. And now here was her daughter, wondering what was happening. And who is that man? Annalie called her daughter over, thrust the phone into her hand, and told her to stay on the line. She'd be right back. And what happened next would be the source of much debate. But in Annalie's recollection, she ran away from the phone for roughly a minute to see if she could save the life of her husband. But it appeared it was too late. The masked intruder had escaped out of their house the same way he appeared to come in. Like a jagged portal, he leaped through the large broken glass window, disappearing into the night. When local authorities arrived minutes later, there was nothing they could do. Annalie's husband, 51-year-old Jukka Lahti, was dead. Thankfully, her 4 children were safe. The time between Annalie's phone call to authorities and the arrival of the police, it was only 9 minutes. But life, as she knew it, was over. For all of the Nordic noir we enjoy in books and on dark, moody, limited series, those cozy Scandinavian crime thrillers, with the sharp-featured, keen-eyed female detective who fights all the bad guys while she battles her own demons, that image is irresistible in crime fiction. But in real life, the murder of Jukka Lahti was handled by uniformed officers and an investigative team from the nearby city of Pori, where the chief of police boasted that there had not been an unsolved homicide in that part of Finland since World War II. That's right, a 100% solve rate. With that kind of track record, this investigation was obviously in great hands. But still, as seasoned as these officers might have been, this crime scene was unlike anything they'd ever seen. And the sequence of events, it didn't follow the usual script. The ones where the victim and perpetrator knew each other, friends or family members, sadly, a disagreement that had turned heated, then deadly, too often fueled by intoxicating amounts of barley vodka or peppermint schnapps. But here, this was different. The local police could obviously see there was a break-in. The large window, nearly the size of a door, smashed through. There was a ferocity and a relentlessness to this case. The intruder came in with a plan to execute, and only left when the job was good and done. The weapon of choice here was a knife. Not surprising in a country with strict gun control laws. And yet, despite multiple knife wounds, Jukka's official cause of death, according to the medical examiner, was blunt force trauma. Fatal blows to the head, perhaps a spontaneous weapon found somewhere inside the house, like a piece of firewood. The cops noticed Annalie's t-shirt had a circle of blood on it, from where she tried to help her husband and the killer slashed her in the chest. That injury was deep enough to puncture her lung, but it wasn't deadly. So what did this killer want? They could tell this wasn't a robbery, nothing was taken, and it wasn't random. This killer specifically targeted Jukka Lahti. But why? Annalie had no idea. but she had full confidence in the authorities. Why wouldn't she? Finland ranked at the top of the list of the world's most efficient, most trusted, and least corrupt criminal legal systems. And at the worst time in her life, at least that was something to bring her comfort. The guarantee of justice. They would catch this killer. It was only a matter of time. The Finnish police brought their full sisu energy to the investigation. Even if they were without a suspect, they did find a possible motive, a few leads early on. One that traced back to Jukka's business trip, the grueling endeavor he'd returned from around 11 p.m. that night before he was attacked. Jukka's job, working in human resources, was for a large copper company, and word was people thought he was kind of a jerk. Who could blame them? As part of HR, Jukka oversaw the latest round of layoffs. Even if he was just the messenger, well, you know how they blame the messenger. The police had to explore the possibility Jukka's killer was an embittered former employee, and logical or not, this ex-employee might have blamed Jukka for his firing. Despite Finland's robust economy and low unemployment rate at that time, securing a good job was a challenge, especially for some of the older workers. It was plausible that one of these men, enraged from losing his job and basically his whole way of life, had followed Jukka home, waiting in his car for the right moment to strike. Jukka and Anneli's home was a detached house, standalone, no shared walls. And it was an older home, well-appointed and nice enough, but nothing flashy. No gates or security. Few in Finland would have anything like that anyway. It would have been easy to find where the couple's bedroom was, even from the outside. Police would later find small bits of brown fibers at the crime scene, and they'd wondered if maybe he'd used a towel or blanket around himself to smash the large window, the one that led into Anneli and Jukka's bedroom. There were other bits and pieces, little clues that might lead to something more. A black glove found on the bed. A bloody boot print near the broken glass window. And, eventually, they'd find DNA. Just a small, tiny amount. DNA that didn't match anyone else in the home. But all that fancy stuff, the processing of DNA, that was going to take a lot of time and a lot of resources. For the time being, officers fanned out in search of witnesses who might have seen something. Now, no one would ever mistake Ovila for Manhattan, but in a strange way, Finnish people were a lot like New Yorkers. They generally mind their own business, but they always have an eye out for something that might look suspicious. And in this instance, there were reports of people seeing a red Volvo in the area. Now, a red Volvo in Finland, it's like a Prius in Berkeley. There are a lot of them. An object of ubiquity to the point of cliché. But it was a lead, and it supported their working theory for the moment, that someone Jukka knew had followed him home with a plan to exact a deadly revenge, bursting in like some wild-eyed homicidal Kool-Aid man, breaking through the glass with his body. He must have been strong, because the breaking of that glass, it only took about a minute. Anneli couldn't see the exact face of this killer. Obviously, it was dark. He was wearing a hoodie and possibly a balaclava. but she did give a description, though admittedly it seemed about as generic as the red Volvo. He was a white guy, average build, about 180 centimeters tall, which is roughly 5'9". That's what Annalie could remember. And her 9-year-old daughter, she said the same thing. She got a brief look of the intruder. She remembered it vividly. Neither of them said they recognized the man. So with a scant physical description, a smattering of DNA, a chaotic morass of clues, but no hard evidence, not yet, authorities went about collecting DNA samples from men all over the area. It was an unprecedented sweep. An estimated 700 samples from 700 men who volunteered. And why not? These were good Finns. They had nothing to hide. It was an extraordinary undertaking, especially at that time in 2006. And for a solid year, the authorities searched for their suspect. 2007, 2008, and still nothing. As police dug deep into their investigation, Annalie tried to move on. She moved out of that place and into a new house and renewed her career as a creative entrepreneur, investing time and energy into her family-friendly blog. Annalie's posts from around that time in 2008 and into 2009, they reflected a devoted mother who loved doing arts and crafts with her kids. And her kids also contributed to her blog, with posts that suggested a perfectly normal and happy childhood. Things like how to make an ice cream sundae. And the photo on the blog was of Annalie, surrounded by her smiling children, all of them blonde, blue-eyed, and beaming. Yuka wasn't in the photo. At first glance, it was as if Yuka never existed. But his memory was, of course, in all of their hearts. By then, Annalie's own heart had healed at least enough for her to make room for a new relationship. She dated a man for about a year, and it seemed serious. But by 2008, they'd parted ways. But that was okay. Annalie was grateful for her children and hopeful that one day, soon, the police would finally catch the man who'd killed her husband. Until then, she'd persevere. It was the Finnish way. When in doubt, sisu. It was March 2009. Spring came slowly to Finland that year. March arrived less like a lion and more like a bear, slow and logy from months in hibernation, with plenty of snow still packed on the ground. That year was especially cold, with record low temperatures. But there was a true bright spot, because areas of Finland also enjoyed a record amount of sunshine, with bright light casting a glow on people's faces, even if they couldn't feel its comforting heat. And in the life of Annalie, there was a ray of hope, a new man in her life, who appeared in her world much like that sunshine, magically, mysteriously, almost out of nowhere. And a man who seemed so focused on her, it was nearly blinding. How she crossed paths with this promising new guy, whom we'll call Peter. Maybe it was fate, a bit of kismet, the right place at the right time, for once. And much like springtime in Finland, the romance between Peter and Annalie, it bloomed slowly. And maybe that was a good thing. Her husband's murder case remained an open investigation. And though Annalie wasn't aware of the status of the case at that point in time, she had to trust things were moving along. By then, the previous investigator had been replaced with a snappy new lead investigator known for being a go-getter who got results. And even after 3 years, the murder of Jukalahti was by far the most high-profile case there was, and it remained a mind-boggling mystery. There were a few dramatic moments, a handful of persons of interest, even an arrest, but it hadn't led to anything. And there was a restlessness, an agitation that bordered on distrust. There was a killer somewhere out there at large, and this was Finland. What was going on? This case should have been solved by now. Maybe Finnish investigators were looking in the wrong place, too far afield. Maybe they should be looking somewhere closer to home. By 2009, Annalie's family blog was a solid business, she was proud to report. A daily destination for Finnish mothers, looking for comfort and some percolating online chatter to enjoy alongside their morning coffee. If one were to visit the website in 2009, you would see all kinds of posts. But there were a few in there that told a different side of Finnish life, the kind of stuff that wasn't listed in the Happiest Country Index. Like how many of the mothers on the site said they were struggling, financially, personally, professionally. Some worried about how they were going to afford essential things, like childcare, even putting food on the table. And embedded in these posts was a hidden code, a sense of shame, a feeling of failure, that they were the only ones in Finland who felt this way, that things weren't quite turning out how they'd planned. Maybe a marriage that seemed to others perfectly happy was in truth hollow and empty. Responses to those posts would be sympathetic initially. Others suggested these women needed to toughen up, deal with the hand you're dealt, and try harder. Just like previous generations did. This was the Finnish way. And by summer of 2009, it seemed Peter and Annalie, they were finding their own way. Their romance appeared to be heating up. Though in Finland, the signs could be subtle. It wasn't always easy to tell. People in Finland think of themselves as introverted, even awkward, where big romantic gestures were frowned upon. It's a bit ironic that in the happiest country in the world, one of their most famous sayings, it goes something like this: "Whoever has happiness should hide it." Big gestures are seen as suspicious. And if you are lucky enough to find happiness, you should have the decency to keep it low-key. Flaunting your success or being overly expressive about your happiness, well, it's kind of like money. Flash it around too much, and someone will soon come along and steal your joy. So they were taking it slow with this budding romance. Annalie was by then in her mid-40s. Peter was apparently a little younger, but he was certainly keen on her, and they spent a lot of time together. He appeared to enjoy spending time with her and her children, and not all men were like that. So why rush things and risk spoiling it? Peter also offered her children a steady male presence in their lives. This was especially true for her eldest daughter, Amanda, who was 12 by then. But the memory of what happened that night with her father, it was seared into her brain for eternity. How could she ever forget waking up, venturing out of her bedroom to find out where the loud, awful sounds were coming from, then seeing a man, a horrible man, dressed in dark clothing and wearing a mask. She didn't see his face, but she'd never forget him, no matter how hard she tried. The loss of her dad, along with the fact that she was there in the house on the phone, aware, even in her own young mind, of what was happening to her father, all while staying on the line with an emergency dispatcher for a call that lasted excruciating minutes as her mother tried to save her father's life. And after all of that, her father's killer was still somewhere out there. One could only imagine how terrifying that must be. And lonely. Because she was the only one in the family, the only one amongst her siblings, who had seen what had happened. The other children had been in their bedrooms and then were quickly rushed outside to safety. The littler ones, they knew their father was gone, but they didn't know, couldn't know, and hopefully would never know the horrific details. But it was a burden for a young girl to carry alone. Peter was in no way her father. She knew that. But at least he was a kind and trustworthy man in her life. And she knew if she ever wanted to talk about what happened that night, well, Peter would always be there to listen. He'd made that very clear from the very beginning. In fact, she noticed that he liked to ask a lot of questions about what happened that night. In conversations that would start one way, would eventually somehow end up back on the topic of her father's murder. You couldn't blame someone for being curious, and there was nothing wrong with talking about what happened, though she didn't have much to say other than what she saw and what her mother saw. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but his curiosity did seem strange. But she pushed those little nagging suspicions about Peter out of her mind. She was 12, going on 13, and she had more important things to think about. That particular summer, she spent most of her time with her friends, in her bedroom or on the phone, concerning herself with what most girls her age cared about. Boys, and who might like her, not murder, and who might have killed her father. So that summer, things were looking up. Peter and Annalie, things appeared to be serious enough that they had talked about maybe getting a place together. Annalie even looked at some apartments. Then once again, seasons changed. Days got shorter, wind chillier, and with the turning of the leaves in fall, it seemed the turning of Peter's affection. Darkness loomed once more, and somewhere in that fading sunlight, Peter also disappeared, stepping out of their lives and into the shadows. He had vanished without apparent word or explanation. He was just gone. When Annalie stopped hearing from Peter, she was stunned and confused. She'd grown fond of him, maybe even loved him. And here, without a word, it seemed, he, was ghosting her? But whatever disappointment Annalie felt at Peter's disappearance, it would soon be replaced by another emotion, one she hadn't felt since that night in 2006. As she watched her husband die a terrible, agonizing death. Pure, unbridled fear. In late 2009, the Finnish police came to see Annalie, and they had some big news. After 3 years, 2 investigative teams, 700 DNA samples, and countless man-hours, they'd finally found the killer. The psychopathic monster who'd managed to elude them for 3 years. Well, they'd finally figured out who did it. And all they needed now was for Annalie to come with them down to the police station. And there is where they'd make it official. Annalie was under arrest for the murder of her husband, Eukalate. Then rest assured, this was more than just an arrest. This was a declaration of war. On November 30th, 1939, when the Red Army began invading Finland, Russian tanks and soldiers easily breached the border of the unsuspecting, unprepared country. It was the dawn of World War II, and Russia went into Finland with swift plans to overtake and occupy the little country. It was all part of their strategic defense against the Nazis after Adolf Hitler invaded Poland less than 3 months earlier. The Finnish army was doomed, outgunned, out-tanked, outmanned. There was no way to defeat the Red Army with a show of force, so they developed a reverse strategy. The Finnish army disappeared. Instead of the standard military khaki or camouflage uniforms, Finnish soldiers dressed entirely in white, head to toe, so they blended into the background, nearly invisible against the banks of heavy snow. Meanwhile, the Russians in their khaki and blue uniforms with red piping, they stuck out like exotic jungle birds, easy to spot, easy to hunt, easy to shoot, easy to kill. And that victory, all those years ago, it taught the Finns a good lesson. The best way to defeat your enemy was to blend into the background, hide in plain sight, and catch them by surprise. So it seems was the strategy of Finnish authorities who'd been investigating Annalie Auer for roughly a year. And part of the hiding in plain sight was introducing Annalie to, essentially, a male honey trap. Peter, the man she thought was her boyfriend, it turned out he was an undercover cop, and his whole assignment was to embed himself into the life of Annalie and her children, and over the course of several months, prime them for information. And the information that he gleaned didn't just come from conversations with Annalie and her daughter Amanda and the rest of the children. The operation also included wiretapping, listening devices in Annalie's home, and recording private phone calls with everyone in the whole family. Annalie had no idea it was happening, and she wouldn't have a clue until her case went to trial in 2010 and it was revealed in the courtroom who Peter really was and the true nature of his so-called mission to get close to her and extract her secrets. Annalie and, of course, Amanda, they felt violated and betrayed. But Finnish authorities could justify this decision by considering this mission as gathering intelligence. It could be argued that it was similar to an undercover cop infiltrating the Hells Angels or a far-right white supremacy gang. Though to those on the outside of law enforcement, it seemed a little extreme and maybe a little desperate. It was also ineffective. For all of the months he spent trying to extract information from Annalie and her children, it didn't yield anything. The only thing it succeeded in doing was further traumatizing Annalie and her children, especially Amanda, when she discovered all of her private moments, including her phone calls with her friends. They were all recorded, listened to, and transcribed by the police. For a 12-year-old kid, it was devastating. But the case moved forward nonetheless, because Finnish investigators said they had all the evidence they needed, a different kind of recording. The emergency phone call to that dispatcher, the one that lasted 4 minutes, but had the potential to put Annalie away for the rest of her life. In Annalie's version of events, she woke to the sound of breaking glass, a masked intruder entering her bedroom and immediately attacking her husband. And her rush to call the police, according to Annalie, it was to try and save her husband's life. But in the eyes and ears of Finnish investigators, that emergency call, it was made to help Annalie get away with murder. With her arrest and subsequent trial, the story of Annalie and the murder of her husband, Jukka. It went from a shocking, unsolved case in a small Finnish town to being described as Finland's crime of the century. And there's something to that. To frame it in American true crime terms, what was happening with Annalie was like a cross between Fatal Vision, The Staircase, and the saga of Karen Reed. A case where nobody could seem to agree on what really happened, and all of the evidence could be interpreted in myriad ways. According to Finnish prosecutors and investigators, what happened that night, December 1st, 2006, it went something like this. Annalie, she'd staged the whole thing. This includes Annalie breaking through the window herself, and the reason why she wasn't cut or even had any scratches was because she'd used a blanket to wrap around herself for protection, which would, in theory, explain why there were brown fibers found on the shards of glass, but nowhere else on her, on Jukka, or anywhere else in the house. Admittedly, they didn't have that actual blanket, but it was an explanation for the previously inexplicable. Because this case wasn't about what they had, it was about what they didn't have, which was clear and compelling evidence that there was an outside person who had broken into the house. Other than the testimony of Annalie and her daughter, there were no signs of an intruder, nothing that they could say definitively, whereas there were signs that it was Annalie. At least in the authorities' version of events, one that painted a far different picture than Annalie promoted in her life and on her blog. That this wasn't one big happy family, but there was great tension between Annalie and her husband. That their marriage was on the rocks. There was even discussion of divorce. And that night, they'd gotten in an argument after Yuka had returned back from his business trip. The altercation quickly escalated. Yuka got a knife, jabbed Annalie with it, explaining her injury, and then she quickly turned it around. And that's when she attacked her husband and stabbed him viciously. And if it had ended there, this might have been your typical Finnish manslaughter case of two people getting in an argument and one killing the other in a moment of passion. But the prosecutors said this was murder because Annalie had believed her husband to be dead when she went to call the police. In the background, she heard sounds of gurgling and moaning, and she realized her husband, he was still alive. And that, they contended, is when Annalie enlisted her daughter Amanda. She had her hold on to the phone, stay on the line, while Annalie went back into the bedroom and finished Yuka off for good, with blows to the head, including the fatal blow, which might have been from a piece of firewood. And so it was her return to her husband, ensuring he was dead. Well, she basically killed him twice. That justified the murder charge, though admittedly they had yet to find the specific piece of firewood that would be proven for certain that it was the murder weapon. But they didn't need it, because they had everything they needed right there in the background, happening in real time, in that emergency dispatch phone call. All you had to do was listen. Now, that phone call, it's available on YouTube. Anybody can hear it. Though, I don't know if you'd want to. Because what's happening in the background, it's pretty obvious that there's someone, a man, presumably Yuka, dying in agonizing pain. No one, it seemed, would dispute that. What was under vicious debate was when it happened, how it happened, and who was there as Yuka was dying. Annalie said there were three: Yuka, an intruder, and herself. Prosecutors, they said it was just two: a husband and wife, a killer, and her victim, a heartless mother, willing to make her own daughter an accomplice. Now, during her trial, this phone call was a crucial piece of evidence, and there's actually a whole book dedicated specifically to the analysis of this one single phone call. And yet, in the end, what people seemed most perturbed by wasn't exactly what was happening, what you could hear, how many people, the distance between Annalie and the phone and her victim. What people seemed to react to most was Annalie's tone. In the ears of the prosecutors, Annalie simply didn't sound like a woman who was upset enough about her husband's murder. And she seemed too calm as she spoke on the phone. And wouldn't a woman whose husband was being murdered sound more upset? Now, this happened in Finland, and their criminal justice system is a little different than ours. And they don't have a jury of peers, but a 3-judge panel who make the final decision, based on the evidence before them, but also with a greater ambition to find out the truth of what really happened. Ultimately, the 3-judge panel determined 2-1 that Annalie was indeed guilty in the murder of her husband, Yuka. And their logic was, There was no evidence of anyone else. She was the only one who could have been there, the only one who could have done it. And that phone call, at the very least, established that she was in the house and that she was the only other person present, beyond Yuka and the children. So when she was found guilty 2-1, that was enough. She was convicted of murder, and she was sentenced to life in prison. And not only was she guilty in the court of law, she was damned by the court of public opinion. After all, Finnish people, they put a lot of trust in their criminal justice system. It's something they're very proud of. They were more likely to trust the Finnish authorities than they were some woman who ran a whole mommy blog, then enlisted her own daughter in the murder of her husband. She had to be guilty, because if she was a good person, a law-abiding person, she wouldn't have been in this situation in the first place. So in 2010, she was found guilty. She was sentenced to a lifetime in prison, which was a significant penalty in the Finnish criminal justice system. And that was supposed to be that. But as Anneli sat in her Finnish prison cell, she knew this wasn't over. She was going to prove that she didn't do this, and she was going to find a way to not only get out of prison, but she was going to prove her innocence, get her children back, and live happily ever after. Because this was, after all, the happiest country in the world. So how will she do that? Can she do it? Find out in the next episode of Dead Sleep. And I am so sorry. I hadn't intended to make this a two-parter, but there was so much material I couldn't fit into this episode. I sincerely hope you don't mind, and you can join me for part 2, which I'll release in a couple of days. We'll get all caught up, so be sure to follow the show so you don't miss it. So thank you so much for listening, and a special thank you to my good friend and go-to comparative criminal law expert, Marnie Riqua, for her expertise in this episode. It's great to be back, and until next time, thank you again and nighty-night.